incredible field of legends at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. In center field behind me is the legendary Oscar Charleston, whom my friend Buck O'Neill would say without hesitation, the greatest baseball player he ever saw. Now, he thought Willie Mays to be the best major leaguer, and most people concur. Willie Mays could beat you every way in which you could be beaten. He could beat you with his bat, with his arm, with his legs, and with his glove. And of course, Willie Mays' career began in the Negro Leagues with the Birmingham Black Barons. But Buck believed the man in center field, Oscar Charleston, to be the greatest baseball player he had ever seen. Oscar Charleston was an early era Negro leaguer who could do it all. The consummate five-tool guy, hit for power, hit for average, could field, could run, could throw. In 1921, Oscar Charleston led the Negro Leagues in home runs, triples, doubles, stolen bases, and batting average in the same season. If you were going to compare him to a major league contemporary, he had the defensive abilities of Tris Speaker, the tenacity of Ty Cobb, and the bat of Babe Ruth rolled into one dynamic package. And old Buck says he never saw a center fielder who could go back on a ball the way Charleston could. So he played a very shallow center field. And so you couldn't bloop it in front of him, and unless you hit it on a rope, you couldn't get it over his head. I'm sure many of you can recall the great running over-the-shoulder basket catch that Willie Mays makes in the World Series. Quite frankly, the throw was better than the catch, but the magnitude of that catch in the World Series, that's what everybody remembers. Well, all the old-timers in the Negro Leagues say, had that been Oscar Charleston, he'd have been waiting for that ball to come down. The legendary Oscar McKinley Charleston. Good morning, everyone, and I guess on the East Coast, good afternoon. And thank you all so much for joining us for a discussion that I am really looking forward to with author Jeremy Beer about the legendary Oscar Charleston. And as the segment of Story, the series that we've been doing with our friends over at Pro Athlete gave you an indication of, Oscar Charleston was a dynamic baseball player who certainly captivated the attention of virtually everyone during his time span in the Negro Leagues. And again, as the late great Buck O'Neill would say unequivocally, the greatest baseball player he had ever seen. And Charleston, and I'm surprised that no one had really delved into the life of this legendary ball player who, as Jeremy Beer will, I'm sure, share with you in his insight on Charleston, perhaps the greatest baseball player that no one has really heard of. And so we're excited to bring you this program today as I reflect on some of the disappointment of last year. And while we had such a tremendous year, one of my biggest disappointments was the fact that I was going to be there, and Jeremy and I were going to be there to put a new tombstone on the gravesite of Oscar Charleston, and we were going to do a ceremony. As we were celebrating the 100th anniversary, as part of the process, and we were going to go back to Indianapolis, where the first Negro Leagues game in 1920 was held between the Indianapolis ABCs and the Chicago Giants. And so in the midst of planning a commemoration of that game, we discovered that Oscar Charleston was buried in a cemetery with a rather nondescript headstone. And so we started a tremendous effort to raise funds to put a proper headstone on the gravesite of one of the greatest baseball players of all time. So many of these players played in anonymity. They should not lay at rest in anonymity. And so we successfully raised the money, but unfortunately, coronavirus kept us from having a ceremony. But I am so proud to say that the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, and thanks to the contribution of so many, including my friends over at the Indianapolis Indians, the minor league club there in Indianapolis, helped us raise the money that was necessary to put a proper headstone on the gravesite of Oscar Charleston. And I'm certainly hopeful, Jeremy, that this year we will have the opportunity to finally get back to Indianapolis and pay rightful tribute to one of the greatest baseball players of all time. So we appreciate you all joining us today. Be on the lookout next week when we make our announcement of Negro Leagues 101 on the actual 101st anniversary date of the birth of the Negro Leagues, February 13th. So this coming Saturday, February 13th, we have a press conference planned for 11 a.m. here at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum to announce Negro Leagues 101, the continuation of our 100th anniversary celebration. Some exciting plans are on tap for what we think is still going to be a tremendous year. And I know with the support of all of you who are watching today and all of you who will be watching later on, that you will continue to support the work that we're doing and make this year just as successful, even during the difficulties of a pandemic, as last year. So with no further ado, I want to turn this over to our Vice President of Curatorial Services, who will lead this conversation this morning with award-winning author Jeremy Beer, and talk about the life and times of Oscar Charleston. Take it away, Ray.
Good morning and afternoon, baseball fans. Greetings from Kansas City, the heart of America. We're glad to have you here. The weather is frightful in so many places around the country, but it's always good to talk about baseball and spring approaching, just a few days away from pitchers and catchers reporting in Florida and Arizona and all places in between. Again, I'm Raymond Doswell. I'm the Vice President and Curator here at the museum, and we're very excited to be able to have you all here for this great discussion. This is one of the opportunities that fell victim to COVID last year, to have this young man come and join us to talk about his very interesting book, and one that is of a person that is certainly well known in the deep history of Negro League circles among researchers and things like that, but always surprising to the general public to learn about how important he was to baseball history. And he is a unique and complicated figure in our history, but one that is worth our discussion. So that is Oscar Charleston. The book is Oscar Charleston by Jeremy Beer, which is available in our museum store. If you go to nlbm.com/shop, you can certainly purchase it there if you don't already have it, but you can certainly buy it in other venues as well. So again, available online, and there's the price there. We welcome you to buy it from us or wherever books are sold. Again, we want to welcome you all here. I see through the chat that we have guests from Indianapolis, as well as across the country and across the globe from the UK as well. We're certainly glad to have you all here. There will be opportunity, when possible. I'll try to work in any particular questions from the chat for our guests as well. But we have lots of questions and lots of things we want to talk about with our special guest. Please welcome, all the way from Arizona, Jeremy Beer this morning. Hello.
Ray, how are you? It's good to be here.
I am well, but not as good as you, my friend, the award-winning author of this fantastic book. First, let me ask just a few questions about you and this book. So tell us just a little bit about yourself. What do you do, and how did you stumble into writing this particular book?
Well, I'm from Indiana, and I did a doctorate in psychology, ended up doing consulting. I do philanthropic consulting, so I have nothing to do with baseball. But it was the Indiana thing that led me to write this book. I've been written on some other topics in my time, and always was a big baseball fan, and came across, of course, as a Bill James fan, and 10 or 12 years ago was finally getting around to reading his new historical baseball abstract, in which he ranks the top 100 players of all time, and was not shocked to see that Babe Ruth is number one. I think Honus Wagner or Willie Mays is two, and the other one is three. And the number 4 player of all time was a man named Oscar Charleston. And I never heard of him. How is it possible that I've not heard of the 4th greatest baseball player of all time? And so that really got me going down a rabbit hole, and discovered that Oscar was from Indiana. And that was even more troubling to me, because how could I be from Indiana and not know that this man's name? especially when my friends and I took pride in knowing who all the great athletes from Indiana were, from Oscar Robertson to Larry Bird to Rod Woodson, all the way down the line. So it was a growing feeling that this man had been unjustly neglected and needed to be recovered for our consideration.
Fantastic. So, I know in our Negro Leagues history circles, I know historian Jerry Strecker had done a lot of work, and then there was a major piece that was done in Sports Illustrated a few years ago. But you're right, he still remained obscure in terms of understanding his history. What would have been the process for you then to go about writing this book? How did you attack the research, considering that, a lot of people didn't know a lot of things about him?
Right. Well, it became pretty clear early on that you weren't going to be able to rely much on secondary sources and just what you would read online and things like that to learn anything very reliable about Oscar Charleston. He sort of existed in a sort of a mythological state, or a half mythological state. There were all sorts of claims made about him that didn't pass the smell test necessarily, lots of contradictory claims. So I went to primary sources as much as I could, back to newspapers from the time, Pittsburgh Courier, Chicago Defender, anything I could find. You can do this now in a way you wouldn't have been able to do just 20 years ago, maybe even 15 years ago, because so many newspapers have been digitized, and you can search thousands of newspapers at once rather than trying to go into 10 microfilm archives and kill your eyes and try to find out one fact a day. So I went back to primary sources, and fortunately, most everything I needed had been digitized, not quite everything, and just went from there. So that the newspapers from the time, and then the oral histories that we have, the interviews with former Negro Leagues players, former National League and American League players that are published and unpublished. So there are some things in archives that haven't been published, but a lot of it has been. And then the last thing, Ray, as you know, was I discovered, it was either Larry Lester or John Schulian who told me that you all have Oscar's personal scrapbook and photo album there at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, which was an incredible trove of photos, of clippings, and a window into Oscar's mind. What did he think was important? Who were his friends? What was his personality like? All that sort of thing. So that was huge as well.
We should say, that object came from his family many years ago, certainly before I started even working at the museum. One of the first major pieces that the museum has, but it's not on display. It's very fragile, and it's believed to be clippings and photos that he collected, but primarily maybe his wife collected and kind of kept track of some things. And the majority of that material is from his time in Latin America, which is fascinating in its own right. And we'll talk about that as well. But as you found in your research, it was tough, and he's obscure, but he's not so obscure because people obviously knew who he was. He was a star player. He was superstar player, and he was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. So he had to be good. He had to be someone of note. But as you came across all these things about him, I was fascinated when you said that he existed in this mythological state. And I don't want to get too far ahead of us, but I am interested in just kind of understanding maybe one or two examples of what you felt were truth versus tall tales about him or his life.
Well, there were one thing, if you were just to Google around right now, you find that John McGraw said Oscar Charleston was the greatest player he ever saw. If you do a little bit more work, you'll see that claim is made about 20 guys. McGraw apparently said that about everybody, or he said it about one person, and a telephone game happened after that. They kind of got things a little bit mixed up. So that was one. I couldn't find anywhere a firsthand source of somebody quoting McGraw saying that. Interestingly, though, what you do find if you do the research is that McGraw was in Cuba when Charleston was there dominating in the Cuban League in 1924, the team called Santa Clara Leopardos. And they were on the same ship back from Cuba to Key West. They're on the ship Manifest, just a few rows from each other. John and Blanche McGraw, his wife, and Oscar Charleston and his wife Janie, just a few rows down. So there's a very good chance they knew each other and may have even spoken at that time. And McGraw would have known about him from, of course, domestic play as well. So that's one example. Another one would be Cool Papa Bell claimed that Charleston once ripped the hood off a Klansman, which was an interesting thing to hear. Now, nobody else says that. It's not reported in any newspaper of the time. You can't find it anywhere else. And Bell said that later in his life. So I kind of am doubtful that really happened. But on the other hand, it's still an interesting thing to have out there because it tells you what people thought about Charleston, what his the guys he played with, his teammates, guys he managed, like Bell. They thought he was the kind of guy who would have done that. That's how tough he was. That's how he didn't back down. So that's interesting in and of itself. But at the same time, we're not treating Charleston very seriously as a historical figure if we just sort of let that sort of claim stand without, some examination.
Indeed. I always reflect and repeat the line one of the lines that the great Buck O'Neill used to always say, don't believe the lie because the truth is better in many cases. So let's back up a little bit on Charleston's life in general. As you noted, he is from Indiana. They called him the Hoosier Comet. And he grew up in Indiana initially. What was he grew up in Indianapolis. So what was his early childhood like in Indianapolis? What was the Indianapolis of his youth like?
Right. So he was born October 14th, 1896, right after his parents had come up from Tennessee. So one thing that was going on in Indianapolis at the time he was born and as a youth was this wave of migrants from the South to the Midwest seeking work. In Indianapolis was undergoing a boom period at that time. There's a lot of industry. There was a lot of work, and his father found work. We don't know exactly where, but in one of those industries. So it was a booming city. It was a more heavily black city, I think, than most people realize. Something like 10% of the population during this time and up through the 20s, maybe up to 1930, was black. Much a higher percentage than other cities in the Midwest or in the Northeast. So there was one particularly thriving black community, Indiana Avenue neighborhood. Madam C.J. Walker was based there, was building an empire. It was later the neighborhood that Oscar Robertson grew up in. In the 20s, it became famous as a jazz and blues. Maybe you have something about this in the Jazz Museum next door. I don't know. But it was considered a principal jazz neighborhood. And it was a kind of all things considered. I mean, there was plenty of racial discrimination and prejudice in Indianapolis, of course. But that neighborhood kind of protected you from some of that. There were black-owned businesses. There was a thriving community life. So that's where Oscar grew up. And there was a lot of baseball too. There were a number of semi-pro black teams in Indianapolis at the time he was growing up. And one of them was the Indianapolis ABCs. His family was very poor, as far as we can tell. They moved from house to house every year. They were in a different house. I think I found in the records something like 12 different places he had lived as a boy. Don't know exactly why they moved around that much, but it may have had something to do with staying in front of landlords who wanted, rent or a higher rent. Mm-hmm. And then he came by. He gets famous later for having a somewhat fiery temper. It seems like he came by that honestly. His mother, Mary, once greeted a deputy on her doorstep with an axe, and was taken to court and booked for that, and had to be got out in a bond posted by her husband. She went on to be a very respected member of the community, but she had a temper too, I guess. And then 3 of his brothers at least had run-ins with the law and did some time in juvie. So it was my take on it is we don't have any sort of diaries or anything like that, but they were on the margins. It wasn't a financially stable and maybe not, sort of emotionally stable household in which to grow up.
Indeed. And we don't want to give too much of the book away. We want to make sure folks get the book and are able to dive into the stories deeply. But there are some important parts of his life that we want to highlight today because he was able to uh, get involved in athletics. Then ultimately was part of the military in that time. Talk about a little bit about that, his arc from youth to military service, and the significance of that for his athletic career.
Well, there's not a lot of opportunity in Indianapolis for someone, a young Black man with an 8th grade education. So at 15 years old, he lies his way into the Army. It's not clear whether he did so with his parents' knowledge or not, but he had to get at least one of their signatures. So either he forged it or one of them willingly put it on the paper. But he's shipped to the Philippines. He's part of the 24th Infantry, which is an all-Black regiment. And it's very important because for 2 reasons. Number one, he starts playing baseball, semi-pro ball in the Philippines. And in 1914 makes his debut as at least a semi-pro baseball player. It's an integrated league. The teams aren't integrated, but it's just a 4-team league. And there's an all-Army team, all-Navy team, all Filipino team, native Filipinos, and the 24th Infantry's team, which is an all-Black team. So he gets to start there. That's very important. And maybe even more importantly, the military he grows up and it leaves its mark on him. He's actually a very disciplined man. I think another thing you would read, if you're just reading online, you might think, this guy's kind of like a borderline psychopath or something, like a thug. He's always getting in fights. That's what everybody talks about. That's not true at all. Not at all. He never drank. He never smoked. He didn't get in any trouble off the field. He was very, very competitive, but he was also very, very disciplined. Show up on time. He believes in all the old school military kinds of virtues. So the military really helps him grow up, I think, and formed him into a disciplined man.
Very good. We're talking with Jeremy Beer here at Baseball Book Notes here at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, talking about the great Oscar Charleston. That is also what I understood about his history even before your book, and kind of confirmed that in looking at it, because ultimately later on he becomes a manager, he becomes a leader of men, and I can tell you from some of a handful of the oral histories we've done of players who interacted with him later, talked about how much they admired him for that role. But that you mentioned that high energy, that stubbornness, that meanness is something that's part of his reputation. And so they all confirmed some of that as well, just in terms of being good ball players, being on time, but also just following the rules, and no one wanted to cross him in any way. And of course, that comparison comes out a lot in talking in comparing him to his contemporaries. As Bob noted in his video, Ty Cobb is the most common comparison, to the point that there was a play written about Cobb, and Charleston is seen as a personification in Black of Cobb as well. What did you see in your research, or just from your observations, in how he was compared to white players, in particular the comparison to Cobb?
Yeah, at first he's compared to Cobb just because he seems like he's the best player in Black baseball, and Cobb at the time was the best player in white baseball. It wasn't a personality comparison at first. That actually only comes later, and maybe Lee Blessing, the author of that play you just mentioned, may have been the first one to really make that kind of comparison, because their personalities, although they were fiery on the field, both of them, and they both would come in to spikes high to any base, get out of my way, do anything to win. Cobb was also hated off the field by his teammates and others, and Charleston wasn't. Now, there were some guys who weren't big fans of Oscar's, but most, as you were mentioning, admired him, respected him, and wanted to play with him. And he was charming off the field. Cobb was never accused of being charming. That he was a monster has been inflated. He wasn't as much of a monster, I think, as we often want to believe, but he still was never accused of being charming. So the first comparisons were just an on-field thing. It was just a way for the press, Black press as well as white press, to sort of indicate just how good Charleston was. And in fact, he ends up being compared more to Babe Ruth than he ever was to Cobb. If you just look at the arc over time, the Cobb comparisons are in the late teens, but the Ruth comparisons start by 1920, 1921 and last throughout most of the 20s. So that was the player he was most compared to. There's a time Charleston played in the California Winter League in 1922, I think, 21, 22, and was so good. And the team was so good that he was on. They were playing against white major leaguers out there. That some member of the white press out there said, "Hey, there is only one other player in the universe who compares to Oscar Charleston, and that's Babe Ruth." So that was the comparisons were very much just like quality of play comparisons, not so much personality ones.
Wow, that's high praise. Even in that time, Ruth was certainly well revered in that time. Talk about, if you would, a little bit about the fact that he was a good player, a good young player after military, and at some point he's involved with the Indianapolis ABCs, but also has the eye of the great Rube Foster. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So Charleston starts with in 1915. He gets out of the military, comes back to Indianapolis, and C.I. Taylor, who's the manager and owner of the ABCs, signs him, and so he gets to start with the ABCs. The ABCs are, and the American Giants. That's the Cardinals, Cubs, Yankees, Red Sox rivalry of the time. They are huge rivals with a very dynamic sort of fan bases who would travel back and forth between Indianapolis and Chicago and watch the games. A lot of talking in the press, a lot of chirping. So Foster definitely knows who Charleston is as he's rising with the ABCs. In 1919, World War I has sort of set everything askew, and C.I. Taylor doesn't field a team, or it looks like he's not going to field a team. And so Foster, who never missed an opportunity, got Charleston to come up, among other players, to play for the American Giants. And so he played for Foster just 1 year in 1919 and has a tremendous year. That's the first year in which it said, like the Chicago Defender, among others, this is the greatest player in black baseball. And Foster helps develop him. There's at least one newspaper account where the reporter says Foster he's either going to make this guy the greatest player in black baseball, or he's going to kill him because he's pushing him so hard on the field. So that was a good pairing. But Foster really proves then the next year to get to the Negro Leagues 101 sort of tie-in. In February 1920, when they're just a few blocks away from the Negro Leagues Museum, right at the Kansas City Y, forming the Negro National League, he allows Charleston, in the interest of league-wide balance, to go back to the ABCs, or at least that seems to have been what was happening. So Foster helped develop him. He recruited him to Chicago, and then he had the magnanimity to let him go in the overall interest of black baseball in 1920.
Yeah, that's Foster. I mean, just forward thinking in many ways. I know folks either loved or hated Foster, but everyone respected him, and he understood the importance of wanting to have professionalism in the leagues and to keep some stability for the leagues as well. I've got lots of other questions, and we're getting a couple from the chat. One that just came through asked, and you've been living with this man for a while now in your head, so you clearly are able to talk about his life and things. But someone asked, what made it to the editing room floor? Is there an interesting story that didn't make the book that stands out for you?
No, I think I put all the interesting ones in. I wish I could say I left some out, because there's not that, as you were getting at the beginning, Ray, it's not like there's such a wealth of material. This isn't George Washington or something where there's such a wealth of material we got to select, or Abraham Lincoln or something like that. Everything interesting made it into the book. But I'll answer that question. There is a part of the book that nobody asks me about that I think is really interesting and I wish I knew more about. And that is in 1939 and 1940, how Jesse Owens gets to be associated with Charleston and the Crawfords. And they travel around barnstorming around the country as part of the then Toledo Crawfords and then Toledo/Indianapolis Crawfords, with Owens racing before games, after games, racing people, racing horses, racing motorcycles, and just what that was all like. It's kind of a poignant story. It's Charleston at the very end of his career, not knowing the Crawfords are really down on their luck. And Owens very much down on his luck only a couple of years after the 1936 Berlin Olympics. So if there's a story I'd like to know more about, and I put in as much as I could in the book, I would really like to know more about that, because Owens never talked about Charleston, even though they had to be. We can tell from newspaper accounts they were friends. And he never he talked about it just nothing but a humiliating experience later in life in the 70s when he's writing his memoirs. I would like to know more about that. I wonder if that isn't a little bit more importing a later sort of judgment of that time than what he felt like at the time, but I could be wrong.
That's true. It's a very interesting time, as I understand it, from Jesse Owens' side, just having lost his amateur status thanks to the closed-mindedness of the Olympic Committee after Germany and after all he and the others on especially the Olympic track team and those black athletes had done, needing opportunities and connecting with primarily the Negro League teams and traveling with them and getting opportunities. And then later on, he gets involved with even a minor league team in Portland, a black team, to help promote them in some ways with his name and doing these exhibitions and things like that. But just an interesting time to have all these paths cross. Excuse me, got my tongue tied there. Just like Jackie Robinson and Joe Louis later on in the 40s, to have these superstars and icons of black sports and entertainment kind of cross. It would be interesting to dive into that more. So if there are any Jesse Owens biographers out there or others who have some insight, please call Jeremy. We want to get more information on that. So we'll welcome more questions in the chat. But would you say, it's still, even with the lack of information, would you say that as you compare his baseball life with his personal life, how complicated of a figure is he?
He is pretty complicated. It's complicated by the fact that we don't have any lengthy interviews with Oscar himself. There's no video of Oscar. There's no audio of Oscar. We know he did do interview on WGN radio before the first Negro Leagues All-Star game in the early 30s, but it doesn't exist. It seems like that has perished. If you know of something, you can tell me, Ray, but I don't know of any audio or video of the guy. And then he died in 1954 before people got around to trying to document, the Negro Leagues and having these long interviews and taping them and so on. So that it's complicated in part by the lack of, other than the scrapbook and photo album and what we can find out from others who knew him and newspaper accounts. We don't have that. So we don't have a direct insight into his personality, but he was complicated. I think people really jumped from, who haven't really dived into the sources, jumped very quickly from, he got into fights on the field. He must have been a mean guy, and he must have been violent off the field. He must have been sort of imbalanced or something. So you have to get the full picture to understand that he was competitive, highly, highly competitive, fiery, and wanted to win on the field. And at the simultaneously charming, and not just charming, but really intelligent. That's the other part of the thing that really makes his personality, it complexifies our picture. Highly intelligent, not just intelligent, highly intelligent. His scrapbook, as you know, Ray, he's got a lot of clippings of non-sports things. Things about the black upper class, about relating to black history, and like racial relations and that sort of thing. He only had an 8th grade education, but also he learned Spanish in short order somehow just by playing in Cuba, to the point where, again, as you know, in the scrapbook, he's translating Spanish into English in his own hand on the margins of some of the articles. There are quotes from him in Spanish in Cuban newspapers. That's remarkable. So he's very, very intelligent, to the point where he befriended sort of elite black businessman and journalist in Cuba. He and Janie were friends with them. There's a lot of pictures of them in the photo album. He befriended a man named Walter Howard Loving, who was a prominent African American in the Philippines when Charleston was just a teenager out there in the military. He had a real talent for attracting the friendships of people sort of higher on the social scale than him, and he had an ambition for that. So yeah, that's all part of the complexity of his personality. Highly intelligent, very charming, ambitious, socially ambitious, also really fiery, and had a temper at least on the diamond. Not well educated. All these things went together. And by the way, I should point out the not well educated thing. You might think, oh, they all only had 8th grade educations. That's not true. Lots and lots of Negro Leagues players had college educations. There was at least one historian thinks maybe a higher proportion of them than white players had at the time. Really interesting. So yeah, he's an interesting mix of all those things, which makes him a very kind of fascinating person.
Interesting. So all those things, and as you noted, well, among those things in the scrapbook that I found most interesting to give to that fiery personality was he was able to get from the newspapers kind of the original cartoon drawings of himself that appeared in some of the newspapers that showed him with his giant back crushing the other team, or a cartoon account of the fights he had, which kind of led to his reputation, but charming as well, and maybe not always as faithful as one might be to his wife, but yeah. He was able to have a lot of suitors, or at least interested parties, come after him as well, but seemed to be, in many respects, somewhat loyal to her in other ways.
Yeah,
just this adds to the complication.
That's right.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I'd just say that is one of his greatest flaws, I would say, is the infidelity that was there with his second wife, Janie, who definitely deserved better, had been very sort of committed and devoted to him.
So someone asked in the chat also about then why does players like Gibson or say Bell get a little bit more exposure, relatively speaking, than other players like Charleston, in your opinion?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I've thought about it a lot. So there are a few answers to that. One would be there has just sort of been, at least up to now, just sort of a limited amount of space in the public mind, or even the baseball mind, for like Negro Leagues players. We make space for Page, Gibson, maybe Bell. I'm like, that's it. Like, there's no more room. Like, we can only talk about 3 guys. So that seems to be one of it, because as the commenter asked, well, it's not just Charleston. It's also like Buck Leonard, John Henry Lloyd, and we could go down the line. There's a lot of other really great Negro Leagues players, as I don't have to tell a lot of the people who are here today, of course, that don't get the recognition they deserve, or any recognition at all. But there are other reasons too. So number one, Charleston didn't have children. If you want to be remembered, it's really, really important to try to have kids. and he didn't have kids. That's just the luck of the draw. And so there was nobody to tend his flame. Cool Papa Bell had someone really tending his flame. Josh Gibson and others have had that fortune that Charleston didn't have. So that's one. Number two, he died young. He died in 1954. He was 57 years old. It's a generation before historians got around to try, again, documenting the history of the Negro Leagues. There's a good 20-year gap where basically the black press is just about the only people talking about the Negro Leagues anymore. So in that time, he died. A lot of people who knew him well died. Those early players, so he wasn't there to tell his own story. Again, now Josh Gibson had the same problem, but he had other people to talk about him. And that, again, Charleston was part of an earlier generation. We don't know anybody part of that earlier generation. Nobody talks about Martin Dahigo like they should, or Cristobal Torriente, or any number of players, John Donaldson, and so on and so forth, Cannonball Redding. That whole earlier generation got screwed in a way, deeply screwed in a way even that the later generation didn't get. Not only because they didn't have any opportunity to play in the white majors, but also they just sort of got forgotten. And then the last thing I would say is his city hasn't claimed him. Indianapolis has not claimed Charleston for some unknown reason that I don't quite totally understand. I mean, obviously it probably has something to do with race, but they haven't forgotten Oscar Robertson, so it's even deeper than that. And again, I just think maybe it's because so much of the Negro Leagues has existed in a sort of a cloud of in like a haze of we don't really, the stats we didn't have, and you couldn't easily get articles about them, and so on and so forth. So the more we can bring the Negro Leagues into history and out of the haze, I think the better chance we have of people like this getting recovered.
Well, I appreciate that, and your book is certainly an attempt at doing that. I guess in a way, and you've alluded to it, if this applies, it's kind of a recency bias. I mean, yeah,
Yeah.
Charleston and some of those other players
Hmm.
um, were pre-Negro League, if you will, to many
That's true.
degrees. Charleston really doing much of his early success and damage in those early years leading up to the Negro Leagues, and helps in some ways pave the way for
Yeah.
the Negro National League and the others that follow, and of course the opening up of Cuba and Latin America
Right.
to these opportunities. So maybe it's just that his history is just still too far away, but hopefully more projects like yours will help bring those stories to light. But so we're very appreciative of you, and the fact that you're doing this and you're being recognized for it certainly is evident by the awards you're getting. So it must be good quality. I mean, the Casey Award is you know, that's a small group of people. They don't just give out Casey Awards, and even it's the Seymour Medal from SABR. So you must be really proud of that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's an honor, but I also, it really does speak to, I think, to Charleston, and I think, as you had pointed out, like, people have known about Charleston in the baseball research community, even if some really big baseball fans haven't known about him. So I think it also just speaks to, like, yeah, finally we've got the book we need, and hopefully there'll be more, because I know other people like Jerry Strecker, that you mentioned before, have done a lot of good work on Charleston. Yeah, I think it speaks to the, like, hunger for this. Ray, there have been very, very few full biographies of players who played their entire careers in the Negro Leagues. Amazingly few. There's one of Bell now. There's Oscar, one or two others. Rube Foster would be one. But that's almost it. It's kind of amazing. There's room for like 20 more easily, like good, deep dive biographies. And you can do it now. Like, there's nothing special about me because it's been digitized. We have, it's easier than ever to kind of get into the records. So yeah, I hope that we see a lot more of these come out. It'll help make the entire era kind of come alive in a really concrete and robust way.
A robust explosion, or maybe a renaissance of
Yeah.
knowledge and history, and hopefully the museum can be there to help serve that. Again, we're here with Jeremy Beer talking about Oscar Charleston and his book, a biography on Oscar Charleston. In the chat, I want to make sure, if you guys have more questions, we have a little more time, about 10 more minutes or so. So please send your questions in. One that I came in a little bit earlier, speaking about Charleston specifically, and I didn't recall this. I know that obviously he played a long time and then he managed a long time, but someone asked about, did he umpire at all? Is there any information that you found on his umpiring?
He did. He umpired in the Negro National League in 1946 and 1947. At least I found accounts of those things happening in contemporary newspaper accounts. At least one of those years, he umpired in the East-West All-Star Game. Now, I'm not aware that he umped in Puerto Rico. So, Bob Poet, who asked that question, if you know something I don't know, I would love to hear it. I've never placed Charleston in Puerto Rico, so it doesn't mean he wasn't there. But I didn't find anything. So yeah, if you've got something on that, I would love to hear it. But he did umpire. That's how he stayed in the game. In 1945, he had been the manager, which we could talk about if you wanted, the Brooklyn Brown Dodgers, which was in the United States League, and there's a whole story to go with that. But that collapsed, and so he stayed in the game in 46 and 47 by umpiring. And then in 1948, he becomes a manager of the Philadelphia Stars, and he's the manager of the Stars for 5 years.
Very good. And there are others like Bullet Rogan, who umpired, and Mule Suttles, I understand, also did some umpiring as well. And so that was and Frank Duncan later on. These are folk who were a little bit younger than Charleston, but certainly found ways to stay involved in the game. So I'm not surprised that he did, but when you have really the superstar of your league turn into being an umpire, it's still kind of fascinating.
Yeah, it is.
Could have imagined a Henry Aaron or one of these other players turning to umpiring. It's pretty interesting. It's like a president becoming a Supreme Court justice later on, which I know has happened. So very, very cool. So talk about that Dodgers, the Dodgers situation, in that he part of that had to do with this maybe the experimentation of finally figuring out how integration was going to happen. So he was kind of in the mix of that. Talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Well, as everybody knows, Branch Rickey had a plan, like a secret plan. He wanted to, as World War II is coming to an end, he wanted to be the first to sign African-American players for the Dodgers. He wanted to get an edge on the competition. And Charleston was part of that plan. Charleston ends up getting mixed up with that plan. It happened, Gus Greenlee, who had been the owner of the Pittsburgh Crawfords, decided he wanted to get back into baseball. And he wanted to get back into one of the two major leagues, Negro National League or Negro American League, and was rebuffed. So he decided he's going to start his own league, the United States League. He pulled some other people together, and they were going to play. There was a big plans for the United States League, going to pay better salaries, going to play in major league stadiums, and all these sorts of things. They bring Charleston in to be the manager of the Philadelphia team in this league. But at this, right around this time, Branch Rickey gets wind of it. We're not exactly sure how. It might have been Wendell Smith from the Pittsburgh Courier. And they have a meeting with Rickey, and he basically says that he'd love to have a team in Brooklyn for two reasons. We're reading between the lines now, but this is what we're told later. One, you can make extra money, which was never a priority far from Rickey's mind, by having a team play there in Ebbets Field when the Brooklyn Dodgers were out of town. And second, it would be good cover for his scouts if he was also involved with a black team, because he had a problem, right? Clyde Sukforth and others can't go scout Negro Leagues games without sort of drawing attention to themselves, especially if they're not that there weren't white fans of these games, there often were, but people might recognize them, right? So he comes to a deal with the United States League owners to get Charleston out of Philadelphia, come up to Brooklyn, and be the manager of the Brooklyn Brown Dodgers, so that Charleston can be one of his scouts and can scout black players Rickey might want to sign. Now, Charleston did not scout Jackie Robinson. That's a claim you might see out there. It's another false claim. They didn't need Charleston to scout Jackie Robinson. People knew who Jackie Robinson was, and he's playing out in Kansas City. But he did scout Roy Campanella and provided good background on Campanella. By the way, this is just Oscar's luck, by the way. Not only he backgrounded Campanella, we know that. Campanella tells us that in his memoir, and calls Oscar Charleston Oscar Robertson. Now, his ghostwriter, I'm sure, is who called him Oscar Robertson. But so you can't even, he's not in the index. Nobody has ever made that connection. But he scouted other early signees for the Dodgers. I'm sure Johnny Wright, because Charleston knew Johnny Wright well, Roy Partlow, and some of the other early black signees. So he was really heavily involved, and he probably was the first. I keep saying this to see if somebody will correct me. I think he's the first African-American to be paid to scout by a National League or an American League team. I think he broke the scouting color line. I can't find anybody else who scouted for an NL or AL team prior to that.
That's possible. That's true. I mean, I know that later on, obviously Buck O'Neil, but Hilton Smith was also someone who did some scouting as well, but you might be right on that point. So excellent insight there. A couple more questions from the chat. Someone just backing up a little bit during his playing career. Someone asked, did Charleston ever actually encounter Ruth or Cobb during any of the barnstorming tours or exhibition games? I'm not sure if Cobb played many of those,
right.
But I know Ruth did, or in some cases, going back before, Judge Landis or right at the cusp of that. Did you ever encounter anything in your research of him playing against them at all?
He did play in barnstorming postseason games against Detroit Tigers teams. But Cobb absented himself from those games. Some of the other Tiger stars played, but Cobb did not. So I do not think Ruth and Cobb ever played, Charleston and Cobb ever played against each other. Same for Ruth. Not that Ruth absented himself, but they never seemed to cross paths on the barnstorming circuit. He did play against Lou Gehrig, a very young Lou Gehrig, in a postseason contest or two in New York. He played against Dizzy Dean. He played often against Jimmy Fox. He was friends with Jimmy Fox, and a number of the other Philadelphia Athletics players. Lefty Grove. Lefty Grove claimed to John Hallway, the great baseball black baseball historian, and baseball historian, I should say. Lefty Grove claimed he never played against black players in his life. Well, it's completely false. We have numerous newspaper accounts. And one of them is him serving up a long gopher ball to Oscar Charleston in Baltimore at one point. He homered off Lefty Grove. He did really well against Major League pitching generally. So no on Ruth and Cobb, but yes against a ton of other well-known white players. And I don't know if everybody understands, but there were a lot of games, black players, black teams versus white teams in the pre-integration era. And it's part of how black players proved both to white players and to themselves that they were good, right? They were just as good. And so they were very important contests.
Excellent. I think my friend Peter Gordon is telling me, who's expert on John Donaldson, that Donaldson probably did some scouting too.
He did.
As well. So
1945. You got to ask Peter if it was before 1945. That's the question.
He notes 1949, at least in his text here. But certainly someone, I mean, a contemporary of Charleston's and played against him a lot.
Yep.
So we're approaching the top of the hour. I've got just maybe a couple more questions before we wrap up. He also, among his managing, was helped lead the Indianapolis Clowns, which was, I guess, his last managing opportunity. And that included, at least for a little while, connecting with the female players that came to the Clowns. How did he feel about that? I think there's a balance of, yes, the Negro Leagues ultimately were welcoming to the women players, but it wasn't, and at least people like maybe Peanut Johnson always thought that she would always say that the men were gentlemen to her, but I know that the transition to Tony Stone and others was not always smooth. What was his role in that, or if any, or his relationship with the female players?
He definitely played a huge role. So he was out of baseball in 1953. The Stars had disbanded, and as Sid Pollock, who was a sort of dynamic promoter type who'd had the Clowns for a long time, brought Charleston on board to manage Indianapolis Clowns. And before the season started in 54, he said, hey, I want to have a couple of women on the team. Tony Stone had been on the team the previous year, but she now was too expensive. Pollock was he was a bean counter. He didn't want to, so he's like, all right, I'll go get some other women. And he found Connie Morgan and maybe Johnson, who are two great baseball players. Had to be two of the greatest female baseball players on the planet at the time. And so he talked about Charleston about this plan before the season started. We have correspondence between them about this. Like, here's how much I want you to play them, this many innings, and they should play these positions and all this sort of thing. Charleston took it very seriously. He knew, first of all, black baseball is entertainment as well as it's just baseball, right? Especially at this time in 1954, we're kind of past the heyday of the Negro League. So he knew that you were putting on a show. You had to draw people to the gate, and this would help. So, but he put them through drills. I think Connie Morgan's the one who tells us that he had her out on, sandlots in Philadelphia in February and March, sliding practice, fielding practice. He was serious. That was Charleston, right? He wasn't just going to have women on the team just for show. He was going to, I'm going to coach you up as much as I possibly can. So he did that for both of them, and both of them had fond memories of him. That they said that he acted paternally toward them and made sure that none of the other players did anything inappropriate. So they seem to have had fond memories. Mamie Johnson told me before she died that he had a wonderful personality, that he was just a fabulous person.
Very good. Someone asked in the chat, had Charleston ever come across or played against or worked with the House of David teams? Or did you find anything about that?
Yeah, I know he played against House of David teams from time to time in those barnstorming games, but nothing. There's no stories, unfortunately, that come out of that about the House of David.
Okay.
Good question.
As we're approaching the top of the hour with Jeremy Beer, someone asking, you noted, of course, that there's some biographies coming out of other players, more obscure players or players that we don't have a lot of information on, and we wish we would. They're asking, are you interested in doing any new projects? or what is next for you?
Well, I'm working on a totally non-baseball biography right now. So that's what's got my attention now. I would like to get back to doing something on baseball and the Negro Leagues, but I'm not exactly sure yet. We'll see. I'll say this: I would like to do a Negro Leagues anthology, edited anthology of the greatest writing on the Negro Leagues. I think that's a gap out there. If someone gets to that before me, that would be great to see, because we don't really have that now.
That's a neat idea, I think, and I think that's one will be certainly well received in the baseball community, just to have a comprehensive example of what the best writing looks like over the years. And there's been some good things, and not all of it's from historians, and some of it's from journalists and others. So it would be good to have that. Well, very good. So again, we want to remind folks that Jeremy's book is available in the Extra Inning Museum store at nlbm.com/shop and wherever books are sold. But you can certainly order one today if you like, and get it in time for maybe a next event that he's appearing. Do you have any other events lined up soon, Jeremy?
Nope, not at the moment. But the paperback of this book is coming out in April if people are interested in that.
Oh, that's true. Well, it came out last year in hardcover, and again, we were very hopeful to have you here then, but so glad to be able to catch up with you now. And we're honored to have helped get the book produced in our small way.
Thank you.
And we're fortunate to be able to have that specific collection. We don't certainly have that level of material on other players. In certainly as Charleston would be. And even though that scrapbook had a lot of good information in general terms, the Negro League players are not necessarily men of letters. So it's always great to be able to be able to have interviews and information and things like this to illuminate such a great light in our baseball history. Once again, folks, we want to thank Jeremy Beer here. We're going to wrap up at this time. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you for your contribution. We thank everyone for participating today, and look for more opportunities like this, more book notes coming soon. And in a couple of weeks, we'll have more children and family books that we will share with you. There's a new children's book on Buck O'Neill that you should look for on February 20th, the program, Saturday morning. And we're anticipating a program on a new book by Mamie Johnson, about Mamie Johnson, who we've mentioned. She was one of the female players in the Negro League. So those will be our next two book programs. So not quite so serious with the history, but but still important topics. And we'll have more authors like Jeremy on throughout the year. So thank you all for attending. Thank you again, Jeremy. We look forward to hopefully seeing you all here at the museum. Stay safe and stay warm in your travels today. Thank you.
Thank you.